This is the Sony Xperia Pro-I. It's not the first phone to have a 1-inch camera sensor, but it's the first one to have a 1-inch camera sensor from the Sony RX100 VII in a phone. Yeah. If you're obsessed with cameras on phones, this past month has been outstanding. First, Apple launched the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro, then Google launched the Pixel 6 and 6 Pro, and now Sony announced the Xperia Pro-I. And the I stands for imaging, according to Sony. Makes sense. Sony sent me a pre-production sample of the Xperia Pro-I, and for this video, this is not a full review. This is more like a first impressions, but we will do a full review once we get the final production unit. Also, being that this is pre-production, there are a couple of things I cannot show you in this video, but there are a lot more things that I can. All right, so let me set this all up for you. For years, many of us had hoped for, had dreamed of a phone that had an amazing camera system built around a large image sensor. Now, a few years ago, Red kind of got our hopes up with a Hydrogen One phone, but that turned out to be nothing more than a mid-tier Android cameras that shot 3D photos and videos for some reason. Now, don't get me wrong, Apple, Google, Samsung all have done an amazing job of combining computational photography to get the most out of the tiny image sensors in a phone. But what if the iPhone 13 Pro, as opposed to having a 0.6-inch sensor, had a 1-inch sensor instead? And that's where the Xperia Pro-I comes in. This is essentially a Sony Xperia 1 Mark III body with the Sony RX100 VII camera sensor inside. Yes, I know. What's amazing here is that Sony was able to put a 1-inch camera sensor into a phone that's not much thicker than the iPhone 13 Pro Max. Now, the benefits of having such a big sensor is you're gonna have a wider dynamic range and you're gonna have improved low light performance, things that a smaller sensor are not great at. When you look at the back of the Xperia Pro-I, it's pretty easy to tell which camera has that 1-inch sensor, but Sony didn't stop there. In fact, the main camera on this phone still has the 24mm equivalent lens as the Xperia 1 Mark III, but Sony added something special, dual aperture. Now, this is a feature we saw on the Samsung Galaxy S9, where it allows you to switch between one aperture and another. And on the Xperia Pro-I, you can switch between f2 and f4, which is fantastic. You have that larger image sensor, so when I go to f2, I can let in a lot of light for medium and low light situations. But if I step down to f4, all of a sudden I get a little bit more depth of field and a little improvement in sharpness, which is nice. Now, you might remember on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark III that it had a dual telephoto lens that could switch between 70mm and 105mm. Sony took that camera out of the phone and then put in a 50mm prime camera on this phone. Unfortunately, it doesn't work because this is a pre-production unit and it's been disabled. So there is that, but I like a 50mm focal length. Who doesn't, right? You know what? Let's cut to a jazzy montage of photos and videos I shot with the 16mm and 24mm cameras on the Xperia Pro-I. Now, as you've been watching this video, you may have noticed a few other changes to the hardware that differentiate it from the Xperia 1 Mark III. And the first obvious one is the camera bump is no longer in the corner. It's centered, it's symmetrical. This is like Wes Anderson vibes going on here, love it. Also, it has this kind of cool Victorian keyhole shape, which I dig. And best of all, it wobbles a lot less. No wobble. If I push down really hard on the corners, I can get a wobble. Just don't do that. Why would you do that? The sides of the phone have a horizontal ribbing that runs around the entire phone. There's still the no SD card tool needed to open the SD card / micro SD expansion slot. And there's a dedicated headphone jack on the top. And get this, on the bottom left, there's a little eyelet. So you can hook a wrist strap. How cool is that? Why don't phones do this anymore? Anybody? No? I think it's cool. The buttons are better. There's still a dedicated shutter button on the bottom right, but it's been redesigned and it's a bit more squishy, which I like. So you can really tell the difference between a half press and a full press. Also, what's nice is we still have the 4K 120 Hz screen from the Sony Xperia 1 Mark III. It also runs on the same processor, the Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 5G processor. Ow. In terms of software, it runs Android 11, but has all of Sony's custom apps, including all those wonderful camera apps. In fact, the Cinema Pro app on this phone gets a new addition. It can record 4K video at 120 frames per second, but save it as a file that is 4K and 120 frames per second. Another big addition is the ability to use eye autofocus in video mode, which is very welcome. So you might remember eye autofocus on the previous Xperia, and that helps lock in on the eyes of people and pets to keep them in focus for photos. Well, they're taking that same technology and applying it to video. Sadly, I can't show it to you on this phone, but just imagine autofocus locking on your eye while video is being recorded. Like the 1 Mark III, the Xperia Pro-I has the Photopro app and the Cinema Pro app, but Sony, well, they wanted to make something for people who wanted a better video option, something that was more advanced than basic video recording, but not as complicated as Cinema Pro recording. And that's where they came up with this new app called Video Pro, and it's aimed really at vloggers and journalists. At the top of the app is an auto button that lets the phone make all the choices about shutter speed, ISO, and white balance, but when you turn it off, you can now tap on the shutter speed indicator to bring up a window to change it. Same with the ISO, as well as automatic exposure compensation and white balance. You can also switch between manual focus and autofocus, and there's a zoom slider that lets you zoom in and out while recording video. And just as the Pro Photo app has a way to record video, the Video Pro app has a way to grab a photo while you're filming. There's even more customizations, like the ability to program hardware buttons on the phone to trigger a shortcut, but I want to talk about this menu setting, Bluetooth Remote Control, which works with the $99 Sony VCT SGR1 shooting grip. The reason that's important is Sony's going to release a new $199 vlogging monitor kit. It comes with a phone mount, a magnetic tiny monitor that attaches to that mount, and then a cable that goes from the tiny monitor into the phone. And this allows you to film yourself with the main rear camera and that 1-inch sensor. I don't have the vlogging monitor kit, nor did Sony give me a photo of it. So instead, I made a reenactment of it using this not Sony phone mount. So what I would do is mount the phone with the back cameras pointing at me. Then I'd attach the tiny magnetic monitor played in this reenactment by a Post-it note. And then last, I'd attach a tiny included cable played by a string of paper clips. It's a pretty elegant solution. The Xperia Pro-I seems like a significant step forward in terms of getting a large camera sensor into the body of a phone. Now, Sony's not the only company that's put a 1-inch sensor in a phone, but the sensor that Sony put in this phone has been through 7 generations of improvements and upgrades and is surrounded by the finesse of Sony's photographic tools. The Sony Xperia Pro-I is going to cost $1,800 in the US, which, when you think about it, think about this, the sensor comes from a camera, the Sony RX100 VII, that costs $1,300. And that camera, it doesn't make phone calls. In terms of the Xperia Pro that came out earlier this year, Sony plans to continue selling it. And there's some things that differentiate that phone and this phone. The Xperia Pro has a micro HDMI port and supports sub-6 and millimeter wave 5G here in the US. The Pro-I has a USB-C port and supports low and mid-band 5G. You can order the Xperia Pro-I starting October 28th, and once pre-orders are live, we'll add a link to the description. The phone ships on December 10th, so you have more than enough time to order your phone and then wistfully think about how amazing it will be when it will arrive. And that's all I've got, but now I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about the Sony Xperia Pro-I? Do you think it's significant having a 1-inch Sony sensor in a phone? And also, what do you think of the price? Throw your thoughts in the comments.